part of this week, gentlemen, of course, the Heritage Committee, and this time Nick Bontis and Victor Montagliani were called in by the Heritage Committee. This is the third committee we've now had. The players have spoken, Canada Soccer has spoken, and now Nick Bontis, former president, Victor Montagliani, same thing, former member of Canada Soccer, now president of CONCACAF, speaking. So after three hearings, gentlemen, Ollie, maybe I'll start with you. What are your takeaways here?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. I think my biggest takeaway at this point is please no more, to be honest with you. Like, I don't want to say they've been completely useless, because I think there's some useful information that's come out of them, maybe in the players' hearing more than any other. But this just does not feel like the way forwards to me. This just doesn't feel like the way we're going to get a resolution here. It doesn't feel like the people, quite frankly, that are going to be the ones to provide a solution here. I don't feel like the people on this committee, with all due respect to them, have the knowledge, the experience to be the people who kind of provide the answers and solutions and way forward for Canadian soccer. And it's getting to the point where I find it a little embarrassing, to be honest, because it's like we can't figure this out ourselves, right, is the implication, and we have to get some outside arbiter to do it for us. So that's kind of where I'm at after this hearing. Again, there are a couple of interesting things to come out of it that maybe people didn't know, and a couple of opportunities maybe for Victor Montagliani and Nick Bontis to explain some of the thinking behind the CSB deal and those types of things. But really what I found myself thinking, watching this hearing and afterwards was, please, like, all sides, I'm not pointing at any one more than any other here, get around the table, negotiate, please figure this out. Like, we should be able to be adults here and do this on our own. And I know there's still, some things that we need to find some common ground on. I know there's probably still a lot of mistrust there in terms of the way each side is working with each other. We have to be grown-ups and resolve it, though, because that's the way out of this for me, is us doing it ourselves. The players know Canadian soccer. I think, the administrators know Canadian soccer. We know it better than anyone else. Let's find our own solutions here rather than handing it over to people who, quite frankly, I don't think have the answers or even the questions to take us in the right direction.
Our tax dollars at work. Oh, jeez. Let's start off by just speaking to what we witnessed on Thursday with Bontis, Montagliani, speaking. The entire process of the day felt very unfocused. I'm not sure if you guys felt the exact same way. Like, the Heritage Committee set up predominantly, as a way to safeguard and check on to ensure that sport is safe sport within the country. What these politicians were trying to get at, I'm not exactly sure, which kind of speaks to this entire process that we've gone through here. I think that there are multiple different agendas at play. What various people, what various groups wanted to get out of something like this. I think that everyone's kind of being left wanting more, and then in the end, wanting way less, because airing your dirty laundry in a way like this, it just reeked of, to me, and this is just my own personal opinion, it was just amateur hour. Ollie said it, just politicians that clearly do not understand the sport in this country, the state of play, the standing, the history, the lack of opportunity that there has been in this country, the way that international football, where it sits in the overall ecosystem and compared to the professional game. It just seemed very scattergun to me. And just for I understand why these politicians go on these long diatribes, that kind of like what you hear from me on One Soccer Today.
You have 6 minutes.
Basis.
But the countdown, 6 minutes, yes. 5 minutes, 4 minutes. I'm going to start counting.
But the intention is different. They're trying to fill the air because they don't think that the witnesses are going to give them answers. But if there are questions that require answering, I really recommend them allow the witness to at least try to answer the question. Yeah. Because there was some random accusations or assumptions or claims that were made kind of in question format, but inevitably they weren't put to Bontis and Montagliani. So it was basically what the politician thought about the matter rather than dealing with facts. In a committee like that, things need to be dealt with on a factual basis, and they simply were not.
I think I just kind of felt a little bit more confused about things, to your point. I didn't know what the focus was anymore. And I wasn't quite sure what the Heritage Committee was doing, to your point there, Wheels. Were you trying to get answers? Were you trying to get to the truth? Or were you really using it as a platform to pontificate and share your own thoughts on things, which aren't necessarily based in fact either? So that's what kind of just became a little, confusing for me. And I was trying to figure out what was going on here, right? Was this more of like a political or public smear campaign, as opposed to really trying to get to the facts? I feel like a lot of the politicians themselves maybe were a little surprised to learn about Canada Soccer's involvement in helping launch the NWSL. I think they were, a little surprised to also learn about certain prize money that is available. There was just a lot that I think they were surprised to learn and then chose not to elaborate on. But Wheels, we also know that there were a lot of questions being asked about the CSB deal. What did we even kind of learn from that?
Well, yeah, a couple things. The first thing, to your point, Andi, it took some criticism at the time, but Canada Soccer actually releasing their proposal to the players in the latest CBA agreement before the hearings even started, even before the 4 women's national team players came to an end, it kind of took that equal pay conversation out of the equation, because that was put on the table right away. And that's something, to me, it's a little bit peculiar, isn't being talked about more, that there is a deal that would provide equal pay, maybe not complete equal opportunity, not addressing all the concerns that are had by all the teams, but that's still very much sitting on the table today. And it kind of maybe changed the tone and temper, maybe the conversation that was had in the Heritage Committee, because when equal pay is brought to the table, it kind of changes the equation to a certain degree. What do we learn about the CSB deal? I think that we learned about the time that it was made. This is what Montagliani especially dealt with. And I think that this was one of the real positives of the hearing, properly articulating the state of play at the time, 2018 and prior to that. No national broadcaster like willing to step up and broadcast and pay money to broadcast our domestic national teams. Like our domestic national broadcast deal before 2019, it wasn't zero. It actually cost Canada Soccer to play their games. I think that's a very important part. And him discussing the fact that the corporate community hadn't come out and invested in Canadian soccer before, that IMG held the contract before CSB came into play, and it was only 1/4 of the total that the CSB is getting now in terms of commitment to sponsorship money, and how sponsorship money in itself isn't enough to sustain a league or an association. There's a lot more that goes into it. And by aggregating your assets, that's how you have a chance to go in and build and turn into something more. And he used some as the model, and the fact that it's the United States and we're Canada, proximity, competitive sports marketplace. I think it's a good comparison. The scales are different. The US is far more wealthy and more people, but the fact that they turned through 20 years of commitment with some who handled their sponsorship and broadcasting rights, they turned it into a $2 billion industry. Here in Canada right now, Canadian soccer is a $25 million industry. And I know that some people were mocking the whole idea of trend lines, but if things go in the right direction, perhaps in a decade or two, in 20 years, that's what it took the US to reach those levels. Perhaps Canadian soccer can turn into a $200 million business or grow. That's how you grow things. The government alone, it's not their job to sustain or build Canada Soccer. We need private entities. We need private investment to build infrastructure, to build an industry that didn't previously exist. And that's what I thought he articulated really well, which kind of answers the question why this deal came into play in the first place and how it continues to help the Canadian soccer ecosystem and industry actually grow and potentially build into something so much more substantial than it even is today.
Yeah, I thought it was kind of summed up by what the Conservative MP Rachel Thomas said near the end of the hearing, where it's like, and I kind of get it, like if you see something and you don't really understand it as a concept or understand why it's been done, you automatically, I think, as a politician in prosecution mode, go to, well, there must be something wrong here, right? She said, she called it fishy. So she said it doesn't make sense. But I really do think it's just a case of a lot of these committee members don't understand why that deal was made, don't understand the thinking behind it, because it probably is quite a complex issue if you're not familiar with soccer and you're not familiar with those types of things that went into the decision. Like Will said, that was kind of the one part of the hearing which was somewhat worthwhile for me, was that Victor Montagliani was able to kind of outline what the idea was, what the plan was, and from going from NWSL funding to CPL ahead of the 2026 World Cup to creating the conditions for a women's league after that. And you can like that plan or dislike that plan. You can criticize them for not moving quickly enough on the women's side of it in terms of securing a women's league. That's all fine. But to suggest there wasn't thinking there wasn't ideas and real intention there, just isn't true. So I posted that kind of exchange with one of the other MPs on Twitter because I thought it was worthwhile and kind of gives you an insight into what the thinking was, right? And then you can make your own judgments on it from there. One other thing I wanted to address on that was that I saw Montagliani was getting some criticism for kind of like, I think some people thought he was taking credit for Project 8 because that's now arisen as the the primary, the way it looks like hopefully we're going to get that women's league. I don't think he was trying to do that. I think what he was saying was that, again, by laying the groundwork with CPL, with the NWSL before that, they were trying to create an environment, a more fertile landscape for investment in the Canadian game, for the conditions to exist in which a women's league can survive, right? And I think Victor Montagliani, quite frankly, is one of the few people who can say that he has played a massive part in doing that, both as Canada soccer president and now as CONCACAF president as well. So that to me is indisputably true, that it's a great thing that nowadays we do have a landscape in Canadian soccer which is much more attractive for investors than it was 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, even 5 years ago, like we always kind of mock, the public, the general public would mock about how our men's team was ranked. I think when John Herdman took over, they were ranked 94th. Like that happened in 2018, the beginning of 2018. Like, I mean, this isn't distant history. Like Canadian soccer was a relative afterthought. Like there is no infrastructure. All this stuff needs to be built through private and corporate investment. And we're not that far away. And just ignoring the history, I think people that have been part of the Canadian soccer community know what a struggle it has been and continues to be to build careers within this game and hopefully build on towards doing something even bigger or better within this game or outside of the game because of it. It's been a massive challenge, and just ignoring that factor and kind of, building the case for why things that there are today, it's just not right and doesn't paint an accurate picture of the entire situation.
I'm a little amazed then at the short-term memory of some people, because it wasn't that long ago where we were praising Victor Montagliani for appointing Karina LeBlanc as the head of women's CONCACAF and creating more games for women in the CONCACAF region. They now have a CONCACAF Nations League and Gold Cup. So if someone doesn't think Victor Montagliani is a supporter of the women's game, they might want to do a little bit of homework there.
Andy, just on top of that, like Bontis was sitting there, and for the mistakes that he made the board. He brought more women into the board than there's been ever before, to be in a position where now there's a woman that's president and then there's a vice president of the Canadian Soccer Association. Now it was just a little bit ironic. Like if you're going to go after, there are things and mistakes that have been made, and part of what these hearings actually did do is show some of the structural shortcomings of Canadian soccer that I think that we've all known about and ranted about and complained about for years. We didn't need a committee to reveal the shortcomings, right? I think people are already quite savvy into the shortcomings of the CSA.
Even just beyond stuff like that, like if you weren't following CONCACAF football maybe 10 years ago, like Google Jack Warner and see how things used to be. Like it wasn't a great place in terms of
Chuck
how that
Blazer.
confederation.
Yeah.
Like
Just
no. Anyways, and there was, a lot that came up. But to your point, there were things that clearly needed to be called out. We've been hearing this from the players. We know, gentlemen, that this hasn't been perfect. And I do, in many ways, I've said this before, I commend the players for stepping up and doing what they're doing. They know they're in a position as well too of power, with the men qualifying for the World Cup and the women Olympic gold medalists. And they're using that for good to try to change things. So there has been a deal by Canada Soccer that's been tabled. We know this, that outlines equal pay. We also know that because of the players pushing, that Canadian soccer business has also come back to the table to renegotiate, especially when it comes to percentages of sponsorship deals coming on in and how they can better share that with the players. We also do have to realize that that came about from players pushing. We have to commend them. So now here we are. We're going to have a renegotiated deal with CSB. We've all seen the contract that was tabled to the players last summer. So where do we go from here, Ollie? How do we now move forward?
I'm not entirely sure, because at this point, I don't know exactly what the sticking points are. Obviously Christine Sinclair came out and did a podcast recently with Julie Foudy and didn't sound particularly optimistic about progress that's been made since the last women's national team window. Bev Priestman and her media availability sounded a bit more optimistic, at least in terms of, enough having been done for the players not to strike ahead of the France game. So I'm not sure at this point exactly where the sticking point is. It sounds like from the women's national team's perspective, that there are still certain things aside from their pay which have not been addressed as much as they would have liked. I think some of that seemed to be in the last release that Canada Soccer put out, where they kind of outlined the entire deal, but maybe not all of it was. Again, I guess there just needs to be some more conversations there to figure out exactly what the holdup still is. How do the men play into it? Because obviously there's three sides in this negotiation that need to agree as well. Is that an issue at all? I'm honestly not sure at this point. There's been points of the negotiations over the past year, 18 months, where, it's been clear what the issue has been and what the next hurdle that needs to be resolved is. I can't say at this point that I know exactly what that is. I just think that, we need to get each side face to face as much as we possibly can in the coming weeks and months to try and work out whatever the sticking points are here.
Yeah, I mean, from the Canadian women's side of the equation, I think we need to hear about what about the proposed deal might not work for them. We have not heard that yet. We were all led to believe that last June, when this deal was originally proposed, that the women were on board. Like, right. Agreeing to a deal was not going to be a problem for the women's team. So what's changed from that point, and what issues still remain that would prevent them from signing such a deal? We don't even know if that's the case. They might be ready to sign, but like Ollie and Andy, you said many times, there's three parties at the table here. Well, 4 or 5 if you include the lawyers for both sides. There's the CSA, there's the women's team, and the men's national team.
Politicians? You know who we love more than politicians?
Yeah.
Lawyers.
and they're all at the table. There's an agreement in front of them. What's causing this deal not to be signed? We're not quite sure. We do know that there's still levels of discontent. That obviously needs to be resolved. But when it comes down to it, Nick Bontis said on Thursday that with this new deal, that just shared prize money, this doesn't include appearance fees, which will pay the Canadian women, make them the second highest paid women in the world, put the Canadian men's national team in the top 10%. That prize money alone from the World Cup, so 3 games for the men and 3 games for the women at minimum. If the women don't even advance from the group, it'll pay each player that's involved in those World Cup setups $138,000 each. That prize
can't
money
be the issue, right? Like,
I mean, that's maybe I'm wrong. It seems like quite a lot of money for that. Yeah. Perhaps I'm wrong on that. I don't think I am. So that number's being thrown out there publicly now. So what are these other issues that are standing in the way? There's a lot of people that speak publicly about complaints or issues that they have with people or some random things. But when it comes down to getting a deal done, the lawyers play a big role in this. What does it say in the contract, and how can that be in a language or in terms that will satiate the needs of all 3 sides? And that's what we're waiting for right now, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think we've heard a lot more from the women than we've heard from the men. To your point, this is now a triangle of negotiations with the men. So what do the men think of this deal? Like, we haven't heard anything publicly either, really from them on how they're feeling about this contract that was tabled by Canada Soccer. And at the time, Nick Bontis was the head of it. And, he reiterated, and we've said this before, he's always supported equal pay. He has never said he hasn't. So that has now been tabled. How do both sides feel about it? I mean, maybe it's about the equal resources. Maybe they want that to be better outlined as far as access to certain resources when preparing for tournaments. Maybe that is something they want to be a little bit more explicit in the language. Maybe I don't know, and I don't want to speculate because they haven't gone public with that. And here's the thing, we may never know until they sign it, because when lawyers get involved, sometimes you cannot legally say things either. I think we as media, we as the public sometimes have to accept that now, with both teams having representation, because the women have had it for a while and the men just got it. You heard Nick Bontis say they just got it on Labor Day of 2022. They've never had anything before. So there was really nobody for Canada Soccer to really negotiate with when it came to the men. But now that both sides are being properly represented, the first thing a lawyer always says to you, not that I'm saying I have a lot of experience with this, but the first thing a lawyer always says to you, zip it. That's what they always say, zip it. So there might not be a lot that we're going to hear from.
Well, Andy, it might take some time to get this done. It took the U.S. Federation 6 years for their players to get a deal done. The women, took them to court. That was actually thrown out of court. But it took the men coming to the table and agreeing and pushing for those terms in order to come up with a deal. What we do know, the men have just played this previous window, which is a good thing. There's zero indication that I've had that they're not going to play in the Nations League final in Las Vegas. That's a big tournament. They want to go out and win that. This is a big game upcoming for the Canadian women's team against France. Top opponent, good competition. It's also being played in France, where if they qualify and when they qualify for the Olympics next year, the games will be played in France. So there's good future benefit to playing this game as well. And although they can legally strike, they could not legally strike during the She Believes Cup. They can legally strike right now. I'm just not sure it serves in anyone's best interest to go on and do that. It seems like some of the budget, I don't know what your feeling is on this, guys, but budget is being was painted out to be a significant issue, and budget cuts to begin with made no sense entering this year. I think that was a huge mistake by the CSA at that time. But judging by how many staff members were with the Canadian men's national team this week, it looks like they're being supported. And based upon Canada Soccer's release on the latest CBA negotiations, they said that they agreed in principle in writing, or agreed to work on 9 different points that the women's team had concerns about, like charter flight for the Jamaica qualifier, single occupancy for rooms, having a chef on hand, these sorts of things. These seem to be all agreed upon now. So what else needs to be agreed upon, or hasn't been agreed upon, that would prevent the women from taking to the field in France in a few days' time?
I just wanted to mention quickly, completely unrelated to that. I thought it was worth mentioning before we move on to the next subject. I think Nick Bontis did the right thing, apologizing to Christine Sinclair yesterday. I was glad he did that. And sometimes maybe apologies seem pretty simple, but we see them botched all the time. And I thought he was sincere. So I wanted to mention that as well.
In all of this, and it's so easy to talk about the numbers, the stats, and just kind of sometimes overarching storylines, and we forget the humans involved. And to your point, Ollie, when Christine Sinclair said that on March 9th when they spoke, I think that all hit us. And it made us realize that, yes, this is an iconic soccer player and a hero, but this is a human being who was hurt. And it just didn't sit well with us. And Nick Bontis apologizing, to your point, it felt sincere, where, he said, I never in a million years, it didn't sit right with him that she was offended. And we also forget that Nick Bontis is also human. And here's why you should never come to an assumption of why you think somebody hasn't done something, because we know he wasn't part of that Canada Soccer Heritage Committee hearing. He was part of this one, was because he was dealing with somebody who was stalking and threatening his family, had to go to court over it. truly worried about the safety of his family. And it was heartbreaking to learn, that somebody was harassing him to the extent that he needed protection and had to go to court. And then I can't even imagine the emotions he has to digest to then when he said that person succumbed to their mental illness. And I think we all know what that means. He's been through a lot as well. And sometimes we forget because we just talk about these things in the open, wide spectrum, and there are always humans on the other end of it. So remember that, as we move forward, there are always humans on the other end of this.
Well said.